In the opulent drawing rooms of Regency England, where bloodlines determined destiny and scandal could destroy lives overnight, Lady Evangeline Hartwell had always believed her future was written in stone. But on one fateful autumn evening in 1815, when the Duke of Ashford arrived at her family's estate with a proposition that would shatter every expectation, she discovered that sometimes the most devastating betrayals lead to the most extraordinary transformations. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you're listening to this story from. I want to know how far it has traveled. The morning mist clung to the manicured gardens of Hartwell Manor like a silk veil, obscuring the ancient oak trees that had witnessed 3 centuries of family triumphs and tragedies. Lady Evangeline Hartwell stood at her bedroom window, watching the groundskeepers tend to the rose bushes that would soon bloom in preparation for the most important day of her life. In just 3 weeks, she would marry Lord Stirling Blackwood, heir to the Earl of Ravenshollow, in what society deemed the match of the season. At 22, Evangeline possessed the refined beauty expected of her station: auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, intelligent green eyes that sparkled with unspoken thoughts, and a graceful bearing that had been cultivated through years of deportment lessons. Yet beneath her porcelain exterior lay a restless spirit that yearned for something beyond the prescribed path of marriage, motherhood, and managing a great estate. "My lady, your mother requests your presence in the morning room," announced her lady's maid, Sarah, as she entered with a breakfast tray laden with delicate china and fresh flowers from the conservatory. Evangeline sighed, knowing that another morning of wedding preparations awaited her. The past months had been a whirlwind of dress fittings, menu tastings, and endless discussions about guest lists and seating arrangements. Every detail had been meticulously planned by her mother, the formidable Countess of Hartwell, who viewed this union as the culmination of years of strategic social positioning. As she descended the grand staircase, its mahogany banister polished to a mirror shine, Evangeline caught sight of herself in the ancestral portraits lining the walls. Generations of Hartwell women gazed down at her with painted eyes that seemed to whisper of duty, sacrifice, and the weight of family honor. She had been raised to understand that her marriage was not merely a personal choice, but a business transaction that would secure her family's financial future and social standing. The morning room, bathed in golden sunlight, streaming through tall windows, buzzed with activity. Her mother, Lady Margaret Hartwell, sat at an ornate writing desk, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. Surrounding her were samples of wedding favors, floral arrangements, and correspondence from various vendors and well-wishers. "Ah, Evangeline, there you are," Lady Margaret said without looking up from her correspondence. "We've received word that Lord Blackwood will be arriving this afternoon to finalize the settlement agreements with your father. I trust you'll present yourself appropriately." Evangeline nodded dutifully, though her heart fluttered with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. Stirling Blackwood was undeniably handsome, with his dark hair and aristocratic features, and he possessed all the qualities that made him an ideal match on paper. He was wealthy, titled, and moved in the highest circles of society. Yet something about his calculating gaze and the way he spoke to servants with barely concealed disdain left her feeling unsettled. "Of course, Mama," Evangeline replied, settling into a chair beside the window. "Has there been any word from Aunt Cordelia about her arrival?" Lady Margaret's expression tightened slightly. Cordelia Hartwell, her late husband's sister, was something of a black sheep in the family, an unmarried woman who had scandalized society by pursuing a career as a novelist and living independently in London. Despite her unconventional choices, or perhaps because of them, Evangeline had always felt a special kinship with her aunt. "Your aunt will arrive tomorrow, though I cannot fathom why she insists on attending. Her presence will only serve to remind people of the family's more eccentric tendencies," Lady Margaret said with a disapproving sniff. The afternoon brought Lord Blackwood's arrival in a magnificent carriage drawn by 4 perfectly matched bay horses. Evangeline watched from her window as he alighted, his movements precise and controlled, every gesture calculated to convey his importance. He was accompanied by his younger sister, Lady Charlotte Blackwood, a beautiful but sharp-tongued woman who had made it clear that she viewed Evangeline as beneath her brother's station. During tea in the formal drawing-room, Sterling regaled them with tales of his recent travels to London and his connections to various members of Parliament. He spoke with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he desired, his voice carrying an undertone of superiority that made Evangeline's skin crawl. "I trust the wedding preparations are proceeding smoothly," he said, his pale blue eyes fixing on Evangeline with an intensity that felt more possessive than affectionate. "I have particular expectations for how my wife should conduct herself in society." The word "my" hung in the air like a chain, and Evangeline felt a chill run down her spine. She forced a smile and nodded, playing the role of the compliant bride-to-be, but inside, a small voice whispered that something was terribly wrong. As evening fell and the Blackwoods departed, Evangeline found herself walking alone in the garden, the scent of jasmine heavy in the cooling air. The stars above seemed to mock her with their freedom, scattered across the vast sky without constraint or expectation. She pressed her hand to her heart, feeling it race with a fear she couldn't name, and wondered if this growing sense of dread was simply pre-wedding nerves or something far more ominous. What she didn't know was that in just 2 weeks, her carefully ordered world would collapse in the most public and humiliating way possible, setting in motion a chain of events that would either destroy her completely or set her free in ways she had never dared to imagine. The morning of October 15th, 1815, dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the diamond-paned windows of Hartwell Manor's grand ballroom. What should have been the happiest day of Lady Evangeline Hartwell's life began with an ominous stillness that seemed to settle over the estate like a shroud. The servants moved with hushed efficiency, arranging white roses and orange blossoms throughout the house, their whispered conversations creating an undercurrent of nervous energy that Evangeline couldn't quite understand. In her chambers, surrounded by a flurry of activity, Evangeline sat before her vanity mirror as Sarah carefully arranged her auburn hair into an elaborate coiffure, adorned with pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. The wedding gown, a masterpiece of ivory silk and Belgian lace that had taken months to create, hung nearby like a beautiful ghost waiting to claim its victim. Every detail had been perfected, from the delicate seed pearls embroidered along the bodice to the cathedral-length train that would sweep majestically down the aisle of St. Michael's Church. "You look absolutely radiant, my lady," Sarah murmured, though her usually cheerful demeanor seemed forced. "Lord Blackwood is indeed fortunate to claim such a bride." Evangeline studied her reflection, noting how the morning light caught the emerald necklace at her throat, a wedding gift from Sterling that felt more like a collar than an ornament. Her green eyes, usually bright with intelligence and curiosity, appeared subdued, as if some inner light had been dimmed by the weight of expectation and duty. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Aunt Cordelia entered, resplendent in deep purple silk that defied the conventional pastels expected of wedding guests. At 45, Cordelia Hartwell possessed an unconventional beauty that came from confidence and independence rather than youth. Her dark hair, streaked with premature silver, was arranged in a fashionable but practical style, and her intelligent brown eyes sparkled with the wit that had made her novels the secret pleasure of many society ladies. "My dear girl," Cordelia said, dismissing Sarah with a gentle nod before taking her niece's hands in her own. "You look beautiful, but I must ask, are you truly happy?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and meaningful. Evangeline had been asked many things in the weeks leading up to her wedding, about her dress, her flowers, her honeymoon plans, but no one had asked about her happiness. The simple inquiry threatened to crack the carefully constructed facade she had maintained for months. "I am content," Evangeline replied carefully, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. "Sterling is everything a woman could want in a husband. He is wealthy, titled, and well regarded in society." Cordelia's expression softened with understanding. "Those are indeed admirable qualities in a business partner, my dear. But what of love? What of passion? What of the meeting of minds and hearts that makes marriage a joy rather than a duty?" Before Evangeline could respond, Lady Margaret swept into the room, her face flushed with excitement and the satisfaction of a plan coming to fruition. "Cordelia, really? You mustn't fill the girl's head with romantic nonsense on her wedding day. Evangeline understands her duty to the family, don't you, my dear?" The carriage ride to St. Michael's Church passed in a blur of countryside scenery and nervous anticipation. The ancient stone church, dating back to the Norman conquest, stood majestically against the autumn sky, its bell tower reaching toward heaven like a prayer made manifest. Carriages lined the cobblestone courtyard, bearing the crests of England's most prominent families, all gathered to witness what society had dubbed the wedding of the year. Inside the church, nearly 300 guests filled the oak pews, their silk gowns and morning coats creating a sea of elegant colour beneath the soaring Gothic arches. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting jewelled patterns across the stone floor and illuminating the elaborate floral arrangements that transformed the sacred space into a garden of earthly beauty. The air was thick with the scent of roses, the rustle of silk, and the barely contained excitement of society's elite gathered for spectacle. As Evangeline stood in the vestibule, her arm linked through her father's, she could hear the murmur of conversation from within the sanctuary. Lord Hartwell, usually a man of few words, squeezed her hand gently and offered what he clearly intended as reassurance. "You look magnificent, my dear," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Your mother and I are very proud." The organ began the processional march, its deep notes reverberating through the ancient stones, and the massive oak doors swung open to reveal the assembled congregation. Every head turned toward the bride, and Evangeline felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her as she began the long walk down the aisle. Her train whispered against the stone floor, and the pearls in her hair caught the light with each measured step. At the altar, Sterling Blackwood stood waiting, resplendent in his morning coat and pristine white cravat. He was undeniably handsome, his dark hair perfectly styled, his aristocratic features composed in an expression of satisfied possession. Beside him stood his groomsmen, including his closest friend, the notorious rake Lord Pemberton, whose reputation for gambling and womanizing was overlooked due to his ancient title and vast estates. As Evangeline approached, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Sterling's expression was not one of love or even affection, but of triumph, the look of a man who had successfully acquired a particularly valuable piece of property. His pale blue eyes held a calculating gleam that spoke of conquest rather than devotion, and when their gazes met, she saw no warmth, no tenderness, only cold satisfaction. The ceremony proceeded with all the pomp and circumstance befitting such an occasion. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself had been persuaded to officiate, lending additional prestige to the union. The ancient words of the marriage service echoed through the vaulted space, each phrase binding Evangeline more tightly to a future she was beginning to dread. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here in the sight of God and in the face of this congregation to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." As the Archbishop spoke, Evangeline's mind wandered to the conversations she had overheard between her parents in recent weeks, hushed discussions about debts, mortgages, and the family's precarious financial situation. She realized with growing horror that she was not just a bride, but a sacrifice, offered up to secure her family's survival. The Blackwood fortune would save Hartwell Manor, but at the cost of her freedom and happiness. The moment came for the exchange of vows, and Sterling took her hands in his grip firm and possessive. His voice rang out clear and confident as he recited the traditional promises, but Evangeline noticed that his eyes kept drifting to someone in the congregation. Following his gaze, she saw Lady Charlotte Blackwood seated in the front pew, her beautiful face wearing an expression of barely concealed smugness. When it came time for Evangeline to speak her vows, her voice caught in her throat. The words that should have flowed easily seemed to stick like thorns, and she felt the congregation's attention sharpen as the silence stretched uncomfortably long. The Archbishop prompted her gently, and she managed to whisper the required responses, though they felt like lies upon her lips. If any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace. The traditional challenge hung in the air, and for a wild moment Evangeline hoped that anyone would object. But the silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of wind through the ancient stones and the rustle of silk as guests shifted in their seats. It was then that Sterling chose to deliver his devastating blow. Instead of proceeding with the ring ceremony, he stepped back slightly and turned to address the congregation, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed sanctuary. My lords and ladies, before we continue, I feel compelled to share something that has recently come to my attention. A murmur of confusion rippled through the assembled guests. This was not part of the traditional ceremony, and the Archbishop looked puzzled and concerned. Evangeline felt her heart begin to race as Sterling's expression shifted from triumph to something far more sinister. "It has been brought to my attention," Sterling continued, his voice growing stronger and more theatrical, "that my intended bride has been conducting herself in a manner most unseemly for a woman of her station. Letters have been discovered, intimate correspondence with a certain gentleman that calls into question her virtue and suitability as a wife." The words hit Evangeline like physical blows. Gasps echoed through the church as the congregation erupted in shocked whispers. She felt the blood drain from her face as she stared at Sterling in disbelief, unable to comprehend what was happening. "This is preposterous!" Lord Hartwell stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "What letters? What gentlemen? I demand an explanation!" Sterling reached into his coat and withdrew a bundle of papers tied with ribbon. "These letters, discovered among Lady Evangeline's personal effects, detail romantic sentiments and promises that no virtuous maiden should make to any man save her husband. They are addressed to Mr. James Morrison, a mere clerk in her father's employ." The lie was so outrageous, so completely fabricated, that Evangeline could only stand frozen in shock. James Morrison was indeed employed by her father, but their interactions had been limited to brief, formal exchanges about estate business. She had never written him so much as a note, let alone intimate letters. "Those letters are forgeries!" Aunt Cordelia's voice rang out from the congregation, her face blazing with righteous fury. "This is nothing but a calculated attempt to humiliate my niece." But Sterling was prepared for objections. "I'm afraid the handwriting has been verified by experts. Lady Charlotte can attest to their authenticity, as she was present when they were discovered." Charlotte Blackwood rose gracefully from her seat, her face a mask of feigned sorrow and concern. "I'm afraid it's true," she said, her voice carrying just the right note of reluctant revelation. "I discovered the letters myself while helping with the wedding preparations. It pains me to speak of such matters, but I could not allow my dear brother to enter into marriage under false pretenses." The church erupted in chaos. Ladies fanned themselves dramatically while gentlemen muttered among themselves about scandal and disgrace. The carefully orchestrated wedding had transformed into a public spectacle of humiliation, with Evangeline at its center, unable to defend herself against accusations that were as false as they were devastating. "I never wrote those letters," Evangeline finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "This is all lies." a cruel fabrication. Sterling's expression shifted to one of mock sympathy. My dear Evangeline, I understand your desire to deny these revelations, but the evidence is quite clear. I cannot in good conscience proceed with this marriage knowing what I now know about your character. The Archbishop, clearly out of his depth in such unprecedented circumstances, attempted to restore order. Perhaps we should adjourn to discuss these serious allegations in private. No, Sterling interrupted, his voice ringing with false nobility. The truth must be known. I will not be party to deception, no matter how painful the revelation may be. As the full weight of what was happening crashed over her, Evangeline realized that this had all been planned. The timing, the public venue, the prepared statements. Sterling and Charlotte had orchestrated this humiliation with surgical precision. But why? What could they possibly gain from destroying her so completely? The answer came with Charlotte's next words, spoken with barely concealed satisfaction. Of course, this unfortunate situation does present certain complications regarding the financial arrangements that were to accompany this union. And there it was, the true motive revealed. The Blackwoods had never intended to honor the marriage contract or the financial agreements that would have saved her family from ruin. They had used the promise of marriage to prevent the Hartwells from seeking other solutions to their financial crisis, then manufactured this scandal to escape their obligations while simultaneously destroying any chance Evangeline might have had of making another advantageous match. The congregation began to disperse, their excited whispers filling the ancient church with the sound of reputation being shredded and social death being pronounced. Some guests looked upon Evangeline with pity, others with the cruel satisfaction that comes from witnessing another's downfall. The wedding that was to have been her triumph had become her public execution. As the church emptied and the magnitude of her disgrace became clear, Evangeline stood alone at the altar, in her beautiful gown, surrounded by the wilting flowers that had been meant to celebrate her joy. The pearls in her hair felt like tears, and the emerald necklace at her throat seemed to tighten like a noose. But in that moment of absolute devastation, as she watched Sterling and Charlotte exit the church with satisfied smirks, something unexpected began to kindle in Evangeline's heart. It was not despair, though that threatened to overwhelm her. It was not shame, though society would certainly heap that upon her in abundance. It was rage, pure, crystalline fury at the injustice of what had been done to her, and a fierce determination that somehow, someway, she would not allow this to be the end of her story. What Evangeline didn't know was that among the departing guests, one person had watched the entire proceedings with growing anger and a dawning plan for justice, and that this devastating day would prove to be not the end of her life, but the beginning of a transformation that would shock society even more than her public humiliation had. The journey from St. Michael's Church back to Hartwell Manor passed in a silence so profound it seemed to echo with the weight of shattered dreams. Evangeline sat rigidly in the carriage beside her parents, still wearing her wedding gown that now felt like a costume from a play that had ended in tragedy. The ivory silk, once pristine and hopeful, was wrinkled and stained with tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. Through the window, the familiar countryside rolled past in a blur of autumn colors that seemed muted and lifeless, as if the very landscape mourned her disgrace. Lord Hartwell stared out the opposite window, his weathered hands clenched into fists on his knees, while Lady Margaret sat frozen in a state of shock that had rendered her speechless for the first time in Evangeline's memory. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on cobblestones and the occasional sob that escaped despite Evangeline's efforts to maintain her composure. When they arrived at the manor, the servants had already heard the news. Gossip travelled faster than carriages in the countryside, and the staff's carefully averted eyes spoke volumes about the scandal that would soon be the talk of every drawing-room in England. Sarah helped Evangeline out of her wedding gown with trembling hands, neither woman speaking, as the beautiful dress was carefully hung away, a monument to dreams that would never be realized. The following days passed in a haze of humiliation and despair. Calling cards that should have brought congratulations instead brought whispered condolences, or worse, were withdrawn entirely as former friends distanced themselves from the scandal. The Morning Post, once eagerly anticipated, now brought only bills that could not be paid and letters from creditors growing increasingly insistent about debts that the cancelled Blackwood marriage settlement could no longer resolve. It was Aunt Cordelia who finally broke through the suffocating atmosphere of defeat that had settled over the household like a shroud. On the third morning after the disaster, she appeared in Evangeline's chambers carrying a breakfast tray and wearing an expression of grim determination that brooked no argument. "Enough!" she declared, setting the tray down with a decisive clink of china. "You cannot remain in this room forever, wallowing in self-pity and allowing those despicable creatures to claim victory so easily." Evangeline, who had spent the past 3 days in her nightgown, staring out the window at the gardens that had once brought her joy, turned to face her aunt with eyes red from weeping. "What victory is there to claim, Aunt Cordelia? My reputation is destroyed, my family faces ruin, and I am unmarriageable. Sterling and Charlotte have won completely." Cordelia sat on the edge of the bed, her expression softening with compassion, but losing none of its steel. "My dear girl, you speak as if your life is over at 22. Do you truly believe that your worth as a human being is determined solely by what society thinks of your virtue or your marriageability? What else is there for a woman of my station?" Evangeline asked, her voice hollow with despair. "I have no fortune of my own, no skills beyond those deemed appropriate for a lady, and now no reputation to recommend me. I am nothing." "You are everything," Cordelia replied fiercely, taking her niece's hands in her own. "You are intelligent, compassionate, well-educated, and possessed of a strength you haven't even begun to discover. The question is not what society will allow you to become, but what you will choose to make of yourself despite society's limitations." Over the following week, Cordelia began to share stories of her own life, tales of the struggles she had faced when she chose to reject marriage and pursue writing, of the doors that had been slammed in her face and the people who had dismissed her as an eccentric spinster. But she also spoke of the profound satisfaction she had found in creating her own path, of the independence that came from relying on her own talents rather than a husband's fortune, and of the respect she had eventually earned through her work. "I have a proposition for you," Cordelia said one evening, as they sat in the library, surrounded by the leather-bound volumes that had been Evangeline's companions since childhood. "Come to London with me. Leave this place, where every stone reminds you of your supposed shame, and discover what the world has to offer beyond the narrow confines of country society." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. London represented everything that had been forbidden to her: independence, anonymity, the possibility of reinvention. But it also meant abandoning her family in their hour of need and venturing into a world for which her sheltered upbringing had hardly prepared her. "What would I do in London?" Evangeline asked, though she could feel something stirring within her, a spark of curiosity that had been dormant since her humiliation. "Whatever you choose," Cordelia replied with a smile. "I have connections in literary circles, among reformers and intellectuals who value minds over bloodlines. You could assist me with my writing, or pursue your own interests. You could attend lectures, visit museums, engage with ideas that would scandalize the good people of this county. You could discover who Evangeline Hartwell truly is when she's not trying to be what others expect her to be." The conversation was interrupted by Lord Hartwell's entrance into the library, his face bearing the weight of a man who had aged years in the span of days. He moved slowly to his favorite chair by the fireplace, and Evangeline noticed how his once proud shoulders had begun to stoop under the burden of financial ruin and social disgrace. "Father," Evangeline began, rising to go to him, but he held up a hand to stop her. "My dear girl," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "I owe you an apology that I fear can never be adequate. I allowed my desperation to blind me to the true character of the Blackwoods, and in doing so I failed in my most sacred duty as your father, to protect you from harm." Tears sprang to Evangeline's eyes at the pain in her father's voice. "You could not have known what they planned, Papa. The fault lies with them, not with you." "Perhaps," he said, though his expression suggested he would carry the guilt for the rest of his days. "But I have been thinking about what Cordelia suggested, and I believe she may be right. Perhaps it is time for you to leave this place and make a new beginning, somewhere you are not defined by this scandal." The decision, when it finally came, felt both inevitable and terrifying. Within a fortnight, Evangeline found herself in a carriage bound for London, her few remaining possessions packed in trunks that seemed pitifully small compared to the elaborate trousseau that had been prepared for her married life. As Hartwell Manor disappeared behind them, she felt as if she were shedding her old skin, leaving behind not just her home, but the person she had been expected to become. London, in November of 1815, was a city transformed by victory and prosperity. The defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo had brought peace to Europe and unleashed a wave of celebration and optimism that seemed to infuse every street corner with energy. The capital buzzed with activity as soldiers returned home, trade resumed with the continent, and society threw itself into a whirlwind of parties and entertainments that had been subdued during the long years of war. Cordelia's townhouse in Bloomsbury was a revelation to Evangeline, who had expected something modest and spinsterish. Instead, she found herself in an elegant Georgian home, filled with books, artwork, and the comfortable furnishings of a woman who had created her own definition of success. The walls were lined with volumes in multiple languages, and the drawing room served as both a salon for intellectual discourse and a workspace where Cordelia crafted the novels that had made her independently wealthy. "Welcome to your new life," Cordelia said, as she showed Evangeline to her chambers on the second floor. The room was smaller than her suite at Hartwell Manor, but infinitely more welcoming, with windows that looked out over a small garden and shelves already stocked with books Cordelia thought might interest her niece. The first weeks in London were a period of adjustment that challenged everything Evangeline thought she knew about herself and the world. Cordelia introduced her to a circle of friends and acquaintances unlike anyone she had ever encountered. Writers, artists, reformers, and intellectuals who gathered regularly in drawing rooms and coffee houses to debate everything from politics to philosophy to the rights of women. At one such gathering in the home of Mrs. Harriet Pembroke, a widow who had scandalized society by opening her own school for girls, Evangeline found herself in conversation with people who spoke passionately about ideas rather than gossip, who valued intelligence over breeding, and who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions rather than her family connections or marriage prospects. "Miss Hartwell," said Mr. Thomas Whitmore, a young barrister who had been arguing eloquently for prison reform, "your aunt tells me you have strong opinions about the education of women. I would be most interested to hear your views." The question caught Evangeline off guard. In her previous life, her opinions had rarely been solicited, and when they were, it was usually about matters of fashion or household management. To be asked about something of substance, to have her thoughts treated as worthy of consideration, was both thrilling and terrifying. "I believe," she said carefully, testing the waters of this new world, "that women are capable of far more than society allows them to demonstrate. We are educated just enough to be ornamental, but not enough to be useful, trained to be dependent rather than self-reliant." "Precisely," exclaimed Mrs. Pembroke, her eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "And that is exactly why we must fight for better educational opportunities for girls. How can we expect women to contribute meaningfully to society if we deny them the tools to do so?" The conversation that followed was unlike anything Evangeline had ever experienced. Ideas flew back and forth like sparks from a fire, each participant building on the thoughts of others, challenging assumptions, and exploring possibilities that had never occurred to her. She found herself speaking with a passion and eloquence she hadn't known she possessed, her mind awakening to concepts and arguments that set her pulse racing with excitement. It was during one of these evening gatherings, about 6 weeks after her arrival in London, that Evangeline first encountered Dr. Elias Reed. He arrived late to Mrs. Pembroke's salon, apologizing for his tardiness with the explanation that he had been attending to a patient in one of the city's poorest districts. Unlike the other gentlemen present, who were dressed in the height of fashion, Dr. Reed wore simple but well-made clothing that spoke of a man more concerned with substance than style. He was not conventionally handsome in the way that Sterling Blackwood had been. Where Sterling was all sharp angles and aristocratic perfection, Dr. Reed possessed a more rugged appeal, dark hair that looked as if he had been running his hands through it, intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see everything, and a face that spoke of character rather than breeding. There was something about his presence that commanded attention without demanding it, a quiet confidence that came from a man who knew his own worth and didn't need others to validate it. "Dr. Reed," Mrs. Pembroke called out as he entered the drawing room, "you must meet Miss Hartwell, who has been enlightening us with her thoughts on women's education." As their eyes met across the room, Evangeline felt something she had never experienced before. A jolt of recognition, as if she had been waiting her entire life to meet this particular person. Dr. Reed's gaze was direct and assessing, but not in the calculating way that Sterling's had been. Instead, she sensed that he was seeing her as she truly was, not as society had labeled her or as her family had tried to shape her. "Miss Hartwell," he said, approaching with an easy stride and offering a bow that was respectful without being obsequious. "I have heard much about you from your aunt. She speaks of your intelligence and compassion with great pride." "Dr. Reed," Evangeline replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Aunt Cordelia has mentioned your work among the poor. It must be both challenging and rewarding." "Indeed it is," he said, his eyes lighting up with the same passion she had seen in the other reformers. "There is much suffering in this city that could be alleviated with proper medical care and social reform. But I find that the greatest reward comes not from the gratitude of patients, but from the knowledge that one is making a difference, however small." As the evening progressed, Evangeline found herself drawn into conversation with Dr. Reed about his work, his philosophy, and his dreams for a more just society. Unlike the men she had known in her previous life, who spoke primarily of their own achievements and ambitions, Dr. Reed seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and experiences. He listened when she spoke, asked thoughtful questions, and treated her opinions with the same respect he would show to any intelligent person. "Tell me, Miss Hartwell," he said during a lull in the general conversation, "what do you hope to accomplish during your time in London? Your aunt suggests you are seeking to discover your own path in life." The question was both simple and profound, and Evangeline found herself considering it seriously for the first time since her arrival in the city. "I suppose," she said slowly, "I am trying to learn who I am when I am not defined by others' expectations. For so long, I was simply Lord Hartwell's daughter, then Sterling Blackwood's intended bride. Now I have the opportunity to discover what Evangeline Hartwell might become if she were free to choose her own destiny." Dr. Reed nodded thoughtfully. "That is perhaps the most courageous journey any of us can undertake, the exploration of our own authentic selves. I have found that we often discover strengths and passions we never knew we possessed when we step outside the roles that others have assigned to us." As the evening drew to a close and the guests began to take their leave, Dr. Reed approached Evangeline once more. "Miss Hartwell, I wonder if you might be interested in visiting one of the charitable schools where I volunteer my services. I think you would find the work both enlightening and inspiring, and your insights would be most welcome." The invitation was unexpected and thrilling. Here was an opportunity to do something meaningful, to contribute to the betterment of society rather than simply existing as an ornament in someone else's life. "I would be honored, Dr. Reed," she replied, feeling a flutter of excitement at the prospect. As she and Cordelia made their way home through the gas-lit streets of London, Evangeline reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few short weeks. The woman who had stood humiliated at the altar of St. Michael's Church seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime who had accepted limitations and expectations without question. "You seem quite taken with Dr. Reed," Cordelia observed with a knowing smile as their carriage navigated the busy streets. Evangeline felt her cheeks warm, though whether from embarrassment or something else entirely, she couldn't say. "He seems to be a man of principle and compassion. Such qualities are rare in my experience." "Indeed they are," Cordelia agreed, "and I suspect you will find that he is equally taken with you. There is something to be said for a man who sees a woman's mind as her most attractive feature." As they arrived at the townhouse and prepared to retire for the evening, Evangeline stood at her bedroom window, looking out over the city that was rapidly becoming her home. The lights of London twinkled like stars, each one representing a life, a story, a possibility that had never existed in the narrow confines of her former existence. For the first time since her wedding day disaster, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. The future, which had once seemed as fixed and immutable as the stars themselves, now appeared full of potential and promise. She was no longer the naive girl who had believed that marriage to Sterling Blackwood represented the pinnacle of feminine achievement. But what she didn't yet realize was that her transformation was only beginning, and that the choices she would make in the coming weeks would not only reshape her own destiny, but would ultimately lead to a confrontation with her past that would shock London society and prove that sometimes the greatest revenge is simply living well. What new discoveries about herself would Evangeline make as she ventured deeper into this world of intellectual freedom and social reform? And how would her growing connection with Dr. Reed challenge everything she thought she knew about love and partnership? The crisp December morning air carried the scent of coal smoke and possibility as Evangeline made her way through the narrow streets of Whitechapel, her practical woolen cloak a stark contrast to the elaborate gowns she had once worn to morning calls. Beside her, Dr. Elias Reed navigated the crowded thoroughfare with the easy confidence of a man who belonged in every corner of London, from the grandest drawing rooms to the humblest tenements. Over the past month, Evangeline had thrown herself into charitable work with a passion that surprised even Cordelia. 3 days a week, she assisted at the Foundling Hospital, teaching basic letters and numbers to children who had never known the luxury of education. 2 afternoons were spent at Mrs. Pembroke's school, helping to prepare lessons and organize the small library that served the eager young minds gathered there. But it was her work alongside Dr. Reed in the city's poorest districts that had truly awakened something profound within her. "The Whitmore family lives just here," Dr. Reed said, indicating a narrow building that leaned precariously against its neighbors like a drunk seeking support. "Mrs. Whitmore has been struggling with consumption, and her youngest daughter has developed a fever that concerns me greatly." As they climbed the rickety stairs to the 3rd floor, Evangeline marveled at how completely her perspective had shifted. The woman who had once worried about the proper arrangement of flowers for a dinner party now carried medical supplies and educational materials into homes where survival was a daily struggle. The change had not been without its challenges. Her hands, once soft and pampered, now bore the calluses of honest work, and her complexion had lost the porcelain pallor that society deemed fashionable. But with each passing day, she felt more alive, more purposeful, more authentically herself than she ever had in her previous life of privilege and constraint. The work was difficult, often heartbreaking, but it filled a void in her soul that she hadn't even realized existed. "Miss Hartwell," called young Timothy Whitmore, as they entered the cramped but spotlessly clean room that served as home for a family of 6. "Did you bring the book you promised?" Evangeline smiled, producing a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe from her bag. "Indeed I did, Timothy. But first let Dr. Reed examine your sister, and then we shall continue with Crusoe's adventures." As Dr. Reed tended to the sick child with a gentleness that spoke of both professional skill and genuine compassion, Evangeline found herself studying his profile in the dim light filtering through the single window. Over the weeks of working together, she had come to appreciate not just his medical expertise, but his unwavering commitment to treating every patient, regardless of their ability to pay, with dignity and respect. Their partnership had evolved naturally, each complementing the other's strengths. Where Dr. Reed provided medical care, Evangeline offered education and emotional support. She had discovered an unexpected talent for connecting with the children, drawing them out of their shells with stories and games that made learning feel like play rather than work. "The fever has broken," Dr. Reed announced, his relief evident as he packed his medical bag. "With rest and the medicine I'm leaving, little Mary should be much improved by week's end." As they made their way back through the winding streets toward more fashionable districts, Dr. Reed turned to Evangeline with an expression of admiration that made her heart flutter unexpectedly. "You have a remarkable gift with the children," he said, his voice warm with genuine appreciation. "I've watched you transform the most sullen and suspicious young minds into eager students. It's quite extraordinary. I find them far more honest than the adults I knew in my previous life," Evangeline replied, surprised by her own candor. "They don't judge based on family name or fortune. They simply want to learn, to grow, to become more than their circumstances would suggest possible. Rather like their teacher," Dr. Reed observed quietly, and something in his tone made Evangeline look at him more closely. Their eyes met and held for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the bounds of ordinary time. In his gaze, she saw not the calculating assessment she had grown accustomed to from men of her former acquaintance, but something far more precious, genuine respect, admiration, and perhaps something deeper that made her pulse quicken with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The moment was interrupted by the approach of an elegant carriage, bearing a familiar crest that made Evangeline's blood run cold. The blackwood coat of arms gleamed in the winter sunlight like a harbinger of doom, and as the vehicle drew to a halt beside them, she felt the carefully constructed confidence of her new life begin to waver. The carriage door opened to reveal Lady Charlotte Blackwood, resplendent in a fur-trimmed pelisse that probably cost more than most families in Whitechapel earned in a year. Her beauty was as perfect as ever, but there was something predatory in her smile as her gaze fixed on Evangeline with unmistakable malice. "Why, if it isn't the infamous Lady Evangeline Hartwell," Charlotte said, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. "Though I suppose we can hardly call you lady anymore, can we? Not after your unfortunate circumstances." Dr. Reed stepped slightly closer to Evangeline, his presence both protective and supportive, though he said nothing. She could feel his attention focused entirely on her, waiting to follow her lead in this unexpected confrontation. "Lady Charlotte," Evangeline replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite the turmoil churning in her chest. "How unexpected to encounter you in this part of the city. I wouldn't have thought these streets would hold any appeal for someone of your refined sensibilities." Charlotte's laugh was like crystal breaking. "Oh, my dear, I'm not here by choice. I'm simply passing through on my way to visit my dear friend, Lady Pemberton. But imagine my surprise at seeing you here, dressed like a common charity worker and consorting with—" Her gaze swept over Dr. Reed with obvious disdain. "Well, I suppose beggars cannot be choosers, can they?" The insult hung in the air like a slap, and Evangeline felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of anger and humiliation. But before she could respond, Dr. Reed spoke for the first time, his voice calm, but carrying an undertone of steel that made Charlotte's eyes narrow. "I beg your pardon, madam, but I believe you are laboring under a misapprehension," he said, with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to command. "Miss Hartwell is engaged in work of the highest moral purpose, bringing education and hope to those whom society has forgotten. If that makes her common in your estimation, then I can only conclude that your definition of nobility differs significantly from mine." Charlotte's perfect composure slipped for just a moment, revealing the vicious creature beneath the beautiful facade. "And you are?" "Dr. Elias Reed," he replied with a slight bow that managed to be both polite and dismissive. "I have the honor of working alongside Miss Hartwell in our efforts to improve the lives of London's most vulnerable citizens." "A doctor," Charlotte mused, though her tone suggested she found the profession barely respectable. "How practical. I suppose when one's reputation is in ruins, one must take whatever companionship one can find." The words were designed to wound, and Evangeline felt their intended sting. But as she looked at Dr. Reed, this man who dedicated his life to healing the sick and helping the poor, who treated her as an equal partner in meaningful work, who saw her true worth rather than her social standing, she realized that Charlotte's barbs had lost their power to truly hurt her. "You're quite right, Lady Charlotte," Evangeline said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I have indeed found companionship of a quality I never knew existed in my former life. Dr. Reed and our colleagues value intelligence over inheritance, compassion over connections, and purpose over pedigree. It's a revelation to discover that one's worth need not be determined by the circumstances of one's birth or the approval of society." Charlotte's eyes flashed with fury at this unexpected show of defiance. "How noble you sound, my dear. But we both know the truth, don't we? You're here because you have nowhere else to go, no other options available to a woman of your tarnished reputation. Playing at charity work doesn't change what you are, a fallen woman clinging to whatever scraps of respectability she can find. And what are you, Lady Charlotte?" The question came from Dr. Reed, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made Charlotte step back slightly. "A woman who destroys others for sport, who finds pleasure in cruelty and takes pride in the suffering she causes. If that is what society considers respectable, then I prefer the company of the fallen." The confrontation might have escalated further, but at that moment a small voice called out from a nearby doorway, "Miss Hartwell! Miss Hartwell!" Young Timothy Whitmore came running toward them, his face bright with excitement, despite the patches on his clothes and the thinness that spoke of too many missed meals. In his hands, he clutched a piece of paper covered with carefully formed letters. "Look, Miss Hartwell, I wrote my name just like you taught me, and I wrote thank you for Dr. Reed for making Mary better." The boy's innocent joy cut through the tension like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Evangeline knelt to his level, accepting the precious gift of his first written words with a smile that transformed her face and made Dr. Reed's breath catch in his throat. "Timothy, this is beautiful," she said, her voice warm with genuine pride. "You've worked so hard, and it shows. Dr. Reed, look what Timothy has accomplished." As Dr. Reed examined the boy's careful lettering and offered his own praise, Charlotte watched the scene with an expression of growing disgust. Here was everything she despised: genuine emotion, authentic connection, the celebration of achievement that had nothing to do with wealth or status. "How touching," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Playing house with the poor. But tell me, Evangeline, what will you do when the novelty wears off, when the reality of your situation truly sinks in? You cannot hide in charity work forever." Evangeline rose to her full height, and for the first time since the disaster at St. Michael's Church, she felt the full power of her own dignity and worth. "I'm not hiding, Charlotte. I'm living. Perhaps for the first time in my life. I'm truly living according to my own values and choices, rather than the expectations of others." "How admirable," Charlotte replied, though her tone suggested anything but admiration. "I do hope you'll maintain that noble attitude when you discover that your little sanctuary here is not as secure as you imagine." There was something in her voice, a hint of knowledge, a suggestion of plans already in motion, that sent a chill down Evangeline's spine. But before she could ask what Charlotte meant, the other woman had already turned to re-enter her carriage. "Do give my regards to your dear aunt," Charlotte called out as the carriage began to move. "I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again very soon." As the Blackwood carriage disappeared into the London traffic, Evangeline felt Dr. Reed's hand gently touch her elbow in a gesture of support and solidarity. "Are you all right?" he asked, his concern evident in both his voice and his expression. "I am," Evangeline replied, and was surprised to realize that it was true. "For the first time in months, I feel as though I can face whatever comes next." But even as she spoke the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that Charlotte's parting comment had been more than idle malice. There had been something calculating in her expression, a suggestion that the Blackwoods were not finished with their campaign of destruction. What Evangeline didn't know was that at that very moment, Charlotte was composing a letter that would set in motion a chain of events designed to destroy not just Evangeline's newfound happiness, but the entire world she had built for herself in London. The battle for her future was far from over, and the next assault would come from a direction she never expected. As they walked back toward Bloomsbury, with young Timothy skipping alongside them and chattering about his plans to teach his sister to write, Dr. Reed found himself studying Evangeline's profile with growing admiration. The woman who had faced down Charlotte Blackwood with such dignity and grace was a far cry from the broken creature who had first arrived in London. She had found her strength, her purpose, and her voice. But would it be enough to withstand the storm that was already gathering on the horizon? And would their growing connection survive the trials that lay ahead? The first sign of trouble came on a grey January morning when Cordelia burst into the breakfast room of her Bloomsbury townhouse, her usually composed demeanour shattered by the newspaper clutched in her trembling hands. Evangeline looked up from her correspondence, letters from the children at the Foundling Hospital filled with their careful attempts at writing, to find her aunt's face pale with fury and something that looked remarkably like fear. "Those despicable creatures," Cordelia said without preamble, throwing the paper onto the table with such force that the delicate china rattled. "They are not content with having destroyed your wedding day. Now they seek to destroy everything you've built here." With growing dread, Evangeline picked up the newspaper and found herself staring at a headline that made her blood run cold. "Fallen Lady Corrupts London's Poor. Charity Work or Calculated Deception." The article, written with the kind of vicious eloquence that could only come from someone with intimate knowledge of society's weaknesses, painted a picture of Evangeline as a manipulative woman using charitable work to rehabilitate her reputation while secretly corrupting the innocent children in her care. The piece was a masterwork of character assassination, weaving together half-truths and outright fabrications to create a narrative that was both believable and devastating. It suggested that her work in Whitechapel was merely a performance designed to attract a new husband, that she had been seen in compromising situations with Dr. Reed, and that her influence on the children was morally questionable at best. "This is Charlotte's work," Evangeline said, her voice hollow as she read the damning words. "She warned me that my sanctuary wasn't as secure as I imagined. I should have known she wouldn't be content with one victory." The article's impact was immediate and devastating. By afternoon, Mrs. Pembroke arrived at the townhouse with tears in her eyes and regret heavy in her voice. The school's board of governors, she explained, had met in emergency session and decided that Evangeline's continued association with the institution would be detrimental to its reputation and funding. "I fought for you, my dear," Mrs. Pembroke said, her hands shaking as she delivered the news. "I told them that your work has been exemplary, that the children adore you, that you've brought nothing but dedication and compassion to our mission. But they fear the scandal will drive away our benefactors." The Foundling Hospital followed suit within hours, and by evening, Evangeline found herself effectively banished from the work that had given her life meaning and purpose. The children she had grown to love would wonder why their teacher had abandoned them, and she was powerless to explain that she had been forced away by the machinations of a woman who found pleasure in others' pain. Dr. Reed arrived at the townhouse just as the winter sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of grey that matched Evangeline's mood. His usually composed features were tight with anger, and she could see that he too had been affected by the scandal. "The hospital administrators have suggested that I reconsider my association with certain volunteers," he said without preamble, his voice carefully controlled but vibrating with suppressed fury. They stopped just short of issuing an ultimatum, but the message was clear enough. Evangeline felt her heart sink even further. "I'm so sorry, Elias. I never meant for my troubles to affect your work. Perhaps it would be best if we—" "Don't," he interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through her self-recrimination. "Don't you dare suggest that we should allow these people to dictate our choices. What we have built together, our work, our partnership, our—" He paused, seeming to struggle with words that carried more weight than professional collaboration. "Our what?" Evangeline asked softly, though she thought she knew what he had been about to say. Dr. Reed moved closer, his brown eyes intense with emotion that had been building for weeks. "Our connection, Evangeline. What I feel for you goes far beyond professional respect or even friendship. You must know that." The confession hung in the air between them, charged with possibility and fraught with complications. In her former life, such a declaration would have been cause for celebration, a respectable man of good character expressing romantic interest. But now, with her reputation in ruins and his career potentially at stake, it felt more like a burden than a gift. "Elias," she began, her voice heavy with regret, "you cannot afford to be associated with me. Your work is too important. Your patients need you too much. I won't be the cause of your professional destruction. And I won't allow fear of scandal to dictate my personal choices," he replied firmly. "I've seen your character, Evangeline. I've watched you comfort sick children, teach eager minds, and face adversity with a grace that puts society's so-called ladies to shame. If the world cannot see your worth, then the world is blind." Before she could protest further, he took her hands in his touch warm and steady in a world that seemed to be crumbling around her. "Marry me, Evangeline, not because you need rescuing, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. We'll leave London if necessary, start fresh somewhere our past cannot follow us." The proposal was everything that Sterling Blackwoods had not been: genuine, heartfelt, based on love rather than calculation. But even as her heart soared at his words, Evangeline's practical mind catalogued all the reasons why accepting would be unfair to him. "You would sacrifice everything for me?" she asked, searching his face for any sign of doubt or reservation. "I would sacrifice everything false and meaningless for something real and true," he corrected. "My work will continue wherever we go. The poor and sick exist in every corner of the world. But the chance to build a life with someone who shares my values, my passions, my dreams, that is irreplaceable." Their conversation was interrupted by Cordelia's entrance, her face bearing an expression of grim satisfaction that suggested she had been eavesdropping and approved of what she had heard. "If you're quite finished with your romantic declarations," she said with a smile that took the sting out of her words, "I have news that might interest you both. I've just received a letter from my publisher in Edinburgh. It seems my latest novel has been so well received that they're offering me a substantial advance for a series of books with the condition that I relocate to Scotland to research Highland history and culture. Evangeline looked at her aunt with growing understanding. You're offering us an escape. I'm offering you a new beginning, Cordelia corrected. Edinburgh is a city that values intellect over ancestry, where a man's worth is measured by his contributions to society rather than his family tree. Dr. Reed's medical skills would be welcomed there, and you, my dear, could assist me with my research while perhaps pursuing your own literary ambitions. The plan that emerged over the following days was both practical and romantic. Dr. Reed would establish a practice in Edinburgh, serving both the wealthy residents of the new town and the poor of the old town. Evangeline would work with Cordelia on her historical research while developing her own talents as a writer, something she had never been encouraged to pursue in her previous life, but which had emerged naturally through her work with the children. But before they could leave London, there was one final confrontation to be faced. The invitation arrived on expensive paper bearing the Blackwood crest, requesting Evangeline's presence at a soirée celebrating Charlotte's engagement to the Duke of Pemberton, the same man who had stood as Sterling's groomsman at the disastrous wedding. "It's a trap," Cordelia said immediately upon reading the invitation. "Charlotte wants to display you as a trophy, to show society how completely she has triumphed. Then perhaps it's time to show her that her victory is not as complete as she imagines," Evangeline replied, her voice carrying a new note of steel that made both Cordelia and Dr. Reed look at her with surprise. The evening of the soirée, Evangeline dressed with care in a gown of deep blue silk that Cordelia had insisted on purchasing for the occasion. It was elegant without being ostentatious, fashionable without being frivolous, the dress of a woman who had nothing to prove and everything to be proud of. Her auburn hair was arranged in a simple but sophisticated style, and her only jewelry was a pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. "You look magnificent," Dr. Reed said, as he handed her into the carriage that would take them to the Blackwood mansion in Mayfair. "But are you certain you want to do this? We could leave for Edinburgh tomorrow without ever seeing those people again." "I need to do this," Evangeline replied, her voice calm but determined. "Not for them, but for myself. I need to face them as the woman I've become, not the girl they destroyed." The Blackwood mansion blazed with light and music, its grand ballroom filled with the cream of London society. As Evangeline entered on Dr. Reed's arm, she felt the familiar sensation of being watched, evaluated, judged. But this time, instead of shrinking under the scrutiny, she held her head high and met each gaze with quiet confidence. Charlotte, resplendent in white silk and diamonds, stood at the center of the room, accepting congratulations on her engagement. When she spotted Evangeline, her smile faltered for just a moment before returning with renewed brilliance. "Why, Evangeline," Charlotte said as she approached, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet room. "How brave of you to show your face here. I wasn't certain you would accept my invitation." "I wouldn't have missed it," Evangeline replied smoothly. "After all, it's not every day one witnesses such a perfect match. You and the Duke are ideally suited, both so concerned with appearances and so skilled at manipulation." A murmur ran through the assembled guests at this unexpected show of defiance. Charlotte's eyes narrowed dangerously, but before she could respond, Sterling Blackwood appeared at her side, his face bearing the same calculating expression Evangeline remembered from their engagement. "Miss Hartwell," he said with a bow that managed to be both polite and insulting. "Still playing at charity work, I hear, though I understand your services are no longer required." "Indeed," Evangeline replied, her voice carrying a warmth that surprised everyone present. "I've discovered that when one door closes, another invariably opens. Dr. Reed and I are relocating to Edinburgh, where we'll be married, and where his medical practice will serve those who truly need healing." The announcement hit the room like a thunderbolt. Here was the woman they had written off as ruined, not only surviving her disgrace, but thriving, finding love with a man of genuine worth and purpose. The whispers that followed were no longer entirely malicious. There was a note of admiration, even envy, in some voices. Charlotte's composure finally cracked. "How touching," she said, her voice sharp with venom. "The fallen woman and her doctor playing house among the Scots. I'm sure you'll be very happy in your reduced circumstances." "I'm sure we will be," Evangeline replied with a smile that was both serene and triumphant. "After all, happiness has very little to do with circumstances, and everything to do with the quality of one's character and the depth of one's connections. I've learned that the hard way." As she spoke, Dr. Reed moved closer, his presence both supportive and protective. The contrast between him and Sterling was stark, where Sterling was all surface polish and calculated charm. Dr. Reed radiated genuine strength and integrity. The assembled guests could see the difference, and many found themselves reassessing their assumptions about worth and value. The final blow came when the Duke of Pemberton himself approached their small group, his face bearing an expression of genuine interest, rather than the polite condescension Evangeline had expected. "Dr. Reed," he said, extending his hand in greeting, "I've heard remarkable things about your work among London's poor. My own estates in Scotland have been in need of a physician with your skills and dedication. Perhaps we might discuss the possibility of your establishing a practice there." The offer was both generous and public, effectively legitimizing Dr. Reed's status, and by extension, Evangeline's choice of husband. Charlotte's face went white with fury as she realized that her attempt to humiliate her former victim had backfired spectacularly. As the evening drew to a close and they prepared to take their leave, Evangeline found herself face to face with Sterling one final time. His expression was unreadable, but she thought she detected something that might have been regret in his pale eyes. "You've changed," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. "Yes," Evangeline replied simply. "I've learned who I really am when I'm not trying to be what others expect me to be. It's been quite a revelation." "And you're truly happy?" The question seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. Evangeline looked across the room to where Dr. Reed was engaged in animated conversation with several gentlemen about medical reforms, his face alight with passion for his work. She thought of the children they would help in Edinburgh, the books she would write, the life they would build together based on mutual respect and shared values. "Yes," she said with absolute certainty, "I am truly happy. Perhaps for the first time in my life." As they left the Blackwood mansion and stepped into the crisp January night, Evangeline felt as though she were shedding the last vestiges of her old life. The woman who had stood humiliated at the altar of St. Michael's Church was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more authentic. "No regrets?" Dr. Reed asked as their carriage rolled through the gaslit streets toward their new future. "None whatsoever," Evangeline replied, taking his hand in hers. "I'm exactly where I'm meant to be, with exactly the person I'm meant to be with." But as their carriage disappeared into the London night, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the Blackwood mansion's window, or the expression of cold calculation that suggested this story was far from over. What new challenges would await them in Edinburgh, and would their love be strong enough to withstand whatever storms the future might bring? The morning mist rolled off the Firth of Forth like a silk curtain, being drawn back to reveal the ancient city of Edinburgh in all its Gothic splendor. From the window of their modest but comfortable home in the new town, Dr. Evangeline Reed, she still felt a thrill at the sound of her married name, watched the sun paint the castle's ramparts in shades of gold and amber. 6 months had passed since their wedding in the small chapel of St. Giles, with only Cordelia and a handful of new Scottish friends as witnesses, yet it felt as though she had lived an entire lifetime in this northern city that had welcomed them with open arms. The transformation in her circumstances was remarkable, but the transformation in herself was nothing short of miraculous. The woman who had once measured her worth by society's approval now found purpose in work that fed her soul and challenged her intellect. Each morning brought new discoveries, new connections, new reasons to be grateful for the path that had led her so far from the gilded cage of her former existence. "Mrs. Reed," called young Moira MacLeod from the kitchen, her Highland accent lending music to the simple words. "Dr. Reed has left word that he'll be late returning from the Grassmarket Clinic today. There's been an outbreak of fever among the tenement children." Evangeline smiled at the girl who had become both servant and friend, another impossibility from her previous life, where rigid social hierarchies had prevented genuine connection across class lines. Moira was the daughter of a Highland crofter who'd been displaced by the clearances, and Evangeline had discovered her working in appalling conditions at a local inn. Now she helped manage their household, while Evangeline taught her to read and write, preparing her for a future that held more promise than mere survival. "Thank you, Moira. I'll be in the study working on the manuscript until he returns. Please see that he has a proper meal when he arrives. He has a tendency to forget to eat when he's tending to sick children." The study that Evangeline had claimed as her own was a far cry from the ornate morning rooms of her youth. Books lined every wall, their leather spines bearing titles in English, French, Latin, and Gaelic. Her writing desk, positioned to catch the best light from the tall windows, was covered with papers, research notes for Cordelia's Highland series, correspondence with publishers, and pages of her own work that grew more confident with each passing day. Her first book, Letters from the Foundling Hospital, had been published just 2 months earlier under the name E.H. Reed. The collection of stories based on her experiences with London's orphaned children had been praised by critics for its authentic voice and compassionate insight into the lives of society's most vulnerable members. More importantly to Evangeline, it had raised both awareness and funds for charitable institutions throughout Britain. The success had been both thrilling and terrifying. To see her own words in print, to know that strangers were reading her thoughts and being moved by her stories, was a validation she had never dared to dream possible. But it had also brought unwanted attention from her past, including a letter from her mother that had arrived just the week before. Lady Margaret's correspondence had been a masterpiece of maternal manipulation, alternating between expressions of pride in Evangeline's literary success and pointed reminders of her duty to her family. The Hartwell estate, it seemed, was still in dire financial straits, and there were subtle suggestions that a successful author might be in a position to assist her struggling relatives. Evangeline had read the letter 3 times before setting it aside to discuss with Elias. Their marriage was built on honesty and mutual respect, and she had learned to value his counsel on matters both practical and emotional. His response had been characteristically direct and supportive. "Your first obligation is to the life we're building together," he had said, taking her hands in his as they sat before the fire in their cozy parlor. "You cannot save your family by sacrificing your own happiness and security. If you choose to help them, it must be on your terms, not theirs." The wisdom of his words was reinforced by a letter that had arrived that very morning from Cordelia, who was currently researching clan histories in the remote Highlands. Her aunt's correspondence was filled with tales of ancient feuds and forgotten legends, but it also contained news that made Evangeline's blood run cold. "My dearest niece," Cordelia had written in her distinctive flowing script, "I have received the most disturbing intelligence from my contacts in London society. It seems that Charlotte Blackwood, now the Duchess of Pemberton, has been making inquiries about your current circumstances. She has been particularly interested in your literary success and your husband's growing reputation as a physician. I fear that woman is not content to let sleeping dogs lie, and I urge you to be cautious in your dealings with any strangers who might seek you out." The warning sent a chill down Evangeline's spine, but she refused to allow fear of Charlotte's machinations to overshadow the joy she had found in her new life. Instead, she turned her attention to the manuscript spread across her desk, a novel based on the Highland clearances that combined historical research with the personal stories she had gathered from displaced families like Moira's. The work was challenging in ways that her previous charitable efforts had not been. Writing required her to delve deep into her own emotions and experiences, to find universal truths in personal pain, and to craft narratives that would both entertain and educate her readers. It was solitary work, yet it connected her to people she would never meet, carrying her voice far beyond the confines of her physical world. A knock at the front door interrupted her concentration, and she heard Moira's footsteps crossing the hall to answer it. The murmur of voices that followed was too low for her to distinguish words, but something in the tone made her set down her pen and listen more carefully. "Mrs. Reed," Moira called, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that was unusual for the normally confident girl. "There's a lady here to see you. She says she's an old friend from London." Evangeline's heart began to race as she made her way to the front hall, her mind immediately jumping to Cordelia's warning about Charlotte's inquiries. But the woman who stood in her doorway was not the Duchess of Pemberton. Instead, she found herself face to face with Lady Beatrice Ashford, the Duke of Ashford's younger sister, whom she remembered as a quiet, bookish girl who had always seemed uncomfortable at society gatherings. "Lady Beatrice," Evangeline said, her surprise evident in her voice. "What an unexpected pleasure. Please come in out of the cold." Beatrice Ashford had changed considerably since their last meeting. The shy, awkward girl had matured into an elegant woman of perhaps 25, her dark hair fashionably arranged, and her travelling dress speaking of both wealth and good taste. But it was her eyes that caught Evangeline's attention, intelligent, determined, and carrying a weight of experience that suggested her life had not been without its challenges. "Mrs. Reed," Beatrice said, as they settled in the parlour with tea that Moira had quickly prepared. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I felt I had to see you. Your book, Letters from the Foundling Hospital. It moved me profoundly. I had no idea that such conditions existed, or that someone could write about them with such compassion and insight." The praise was genuine, and Evangeline felt herself relaxing slightly. "Thank you. It was important to me that those children's stories be told, that their struggles and triumphs be recognized. Which is precisely why I'm here," Beatrice continued, leaning forward with an intensity that reminded Evangeline of her brother's focused attention. "I've been working with a group of reformers in London, trying to improve conditions in workhouses and orphanages. Your book has given us exactly the kind of authentic voice we need to convince Parliament to act." As their conversation continued, Evangeline learned that Beatrice had undergone her own transformation since their last meeting. Refusing her family's attempts to arrange a suitable marriage, she had instead dedicated herself to social reform, using her considerable fortune and family connections to advocate for the poor and disenfranchised. "I've established a foundation," Beatrice explained, her eyes bright with passion for her work. "We're funding schools, medical clinics, and housing projects throughout England, but we need more than money. We need voices that can reach people's hearts as well as their minds. We need writers like you." The offer that followed was both flattering and tempting. Beatrice wanted to commission Evangeline to write a series of books documenting social conditions throughout Britain, with the foundation providing both financial support and access to institutions that were normally closed to outside observers. "The work would require some travel," Beatrice admitted, "but you could base yourself wherever you choose. Your husband's medical expertise would actually be invaluable. We're particularly interested in documenting the connection between poverty and disease." As Evangeline listened to the proposal, she felt a familiar stirring of excitement and purpose. Here was an opportunity to expand her work, to reach even more people with stories that needed to be told. But it also represented a return to the public eye. a visibility that might attract unwanted attention from those who preferred to keep their past buried. "It's a generous offer," Evangeline said carefully, "but I must discuss it with my husband before making any commitments. Our life here in Edinburgh has been peaceful. I'm not certain we're ready to invite the complications that such visibility might bring." Beatrice nodded understandingly. "Of course, but I hope you'll consider it seriously. Your voice has the power to change lives, Mrs. Reed. It would be a shame to limit its reach out of fear of those who would rather silence it." That evening, as Evangeline and Elias sat before their fire discussing Beatrice's proposal, she found herself torn between excitement and apprehension. The work would be meaningful, the compensation generous, and the platform unprecedented. But it would also mean stepping back into a world they had worked so hard to leave behind. "What does your heart tell you?" Elias asked, his medical bag set aside after another long day of tending to Edinburgh's poor and sick. "That I want to do it," Evangeline admitted. "That I want to use whatever talent I have to make a difference in the world. But my head warns me that we've found something precious here: peace, anonymity, the freedom to live according to our own values. Am I foolish to risk that for the sake of ambition?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as he considered her words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same certainty that had convinced her to marry him. "You're not the same woman who fled London in disgrace," he said, taking her hand in his. "You've found your strength, your voice, your purpose. Charlotte Blackwood and her ilk can only hurt you if you give them that power. And frankly, my dear, I think you've grown far beyond their ability to touch." His confidence in her was both humbling and empowering. Over the months of their marriage, Evangeline had indeed discovered reserves of strength and resilience she hadn't known she possessed. The work with the children, the success of her book, the deep satisfaction of a marriage built on mutual respect and shared values, all of it had contributed to a sense of self-worth that no external force could easily shake. "Besides," Elias continued with a smile that made her heart flutter, just as it had during their first meeting, "I've always wanted to see more of Scotland. And if our work can help improve conditions for the poor throughout Britain, isn't that worth any personal risk?" The decision, when it finally came, felt as natural as breathing. They would accept Beatrice's commission, but on their own terms. Edinburgh would remain their home base, their sanctuary, but they would travel throughout Scotland and northern England, documenting the lives of those whom society preferred to ignore. 3 weeks later, as they prepared for their first research expedition to the industrial cities of the Scottish lowlands, Evangeline received a letter that made her smile with genuine amusement. It was from her mother, and its tone was markedly different from the manipulative missive she had received earlier. "My dearest daughter," Lady Margaret had written, "I have just learned of your commission from Lady Beatrice's foundation, and I must confess to feeling a pride that I fear I have not always expressed adequately. Your father and I have been reading your book, and we are amazed by the woman you have become. Perhaps we were wrong to try to shape you into something you were never meant to be. We hope that someday you might find it in your heart to forgive us for our failures as parents." The letter went on to share news of the estate, improvements that had been made possible by careful management rather than advantageous marriage, and a growing sense of hope for the future. Most surprisingly, it mentioned that Lord Hartwell had begun implementing some of the social reforms that Evangeline had written about, improving conditions for the tenant farmers and establishing a small school for their children. "It seems," Lady Margaret concluded, "that our daughter's influence extends even to those who thought they had nothing left to learn." As Evangeline folded the letter and placed it in her writing desk, she reflected on how completely her life had changed. The woman who had once measured her worth by others' approval now found validation in work that challenged injustice and gave voice to the voiceless. The girl, who had been raised to be ornamental, had become instrumental in creating change. But perhaps most remarkably, the heart that had been broken by betrayal and humiliation had healed stronger than before, capable of love that was both passionate and practical, romantic and realistic. As she looked across the room to where Elias sat reading medical journals by lamplight, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that still made her pulse quicken, she marveled at the journey that had brought them together. A soft knock at the door interrupted her reverie, and Moira entered with the evening post. Among the usual correspondence was a package bearing the seal of Evangeline's London publisher, and inside she found advance copies of her second book, the Highland novel that had consumed so many months of research and writing. The Clearances, a Highland tragedy, Elias read aloud as he examined the elegant cover, by E.H. Reed, my brilliant wife, the celebrated author. Indeed, our brilliant partnership, Evangeline corrected, moving to sit beside him on the sofa they had chosen together. None of this would have been possible without your support, your encouragement, your willingness to build a life that honors both our dreams. As they sat together in their cozy parlor, surrounded by books and papers and the comfortable chaos of a life lived with purpose, Evangeline thought about the letter she had received from Charlotte's former lady's maid just the month before. The woman, dismissed for some minor infraction, had written to share gossip that she thought might interest her former mistress's victim. The Duchess of Pemberton, it seemed, was not enjoying the married life she had schemed so hard to achieve. The Duke, while wealthy and titled, was proving to be a cold and controlling husband who treated his wife more like a possession than a partner. Charlotte's beauty was already beginning to fade under the strain of constant criticism and social isolation, as her husband preferred to keep her away from London society and its temptations. Meanwhile, Sterling Blackwood had gambled away much of his inheritance and was rumoured to be seeking a wealthy American heiress to restore his fortunes. The man who had once seemed so powerful and desirable was now viewed by society as something of a joke, a cautionary tale about the dangers of valuing appearance over substance. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Sterling hadn't humiliated you at the altar? Elias asked, as if reading her thoughts. Evangeline considered the question seriously, imagining the life she would have lived as Lady Blackwood, the empty social obligations, the loveless marriage, the gradual erosion of her spirit under the weight of others' expectations. I think I would have died, she said finally, the words carrying more truth than poetry. Not physically, perhaps, but everything that makes me who I am would have withered away until nothing remained but a beautiful shell. In a strange way, Charlotte and Sterling gave me the greatest gift imaginable. They forced me to discover who I really am when I'm not trying to be what others expect me to be. As the clock chimed 10 and they prepared to retire for the evening, Evangeline took one last look around the room that had become the center of their shared life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories to tell, new injustices to expose. But tonight, she was simply a woman who had found her place in the world, her purpose in life, and her perfect partner in love. The girl who had stood humiliated at the altar of St. Michael's Church was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had learned that true happiness comes not from meeting others' expectations, but from exceeding your own. And as she took her husband's hand, and they climbed the stairs to their bedroom, Evangeline Reed knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person she was meant to love, living exactly the life she was meant to live. The future stretched before them like an unwritten book, full of possibilities and promise, and she could hardly wait to discover what the next chapter would bring. If this story of transformation and triumph has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage, love, and the power of choosing your own destiny. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to reinvent yourself after a devastating setback? What gave you the strength to keep going? Your stories inspire others who may be facing their own dark moments, reminding them that sometimes the most beautiful flowers bloom in the most unexpected soil.